as technology gets more complicated, which direction to actually take is sometimes quite difficult. So it kind of goes back to ideally testing with users if you can, which isn't always possible, but when it is, it's a really, really helpful thing to do.
This is Velocitize Talks, and I'm Eric Jones. I'm here with Simon Jones, founder and managing director of Studio 24. Simon.
Hello.
It's great to have you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Tell us a little bit about Studio 24 and your unique value proposition in the marketplace.
Cool. So we're a specialist digital agency. We specialize in user-centered design and developing with open source technology. Quite a range of clients from kind of charities and public sector. Kind of specialise a lot in transport clients as well. Been working with Crossrail for over a decade now. And we basically develop solutions for clients that kind of meets user needs and based on the WordPress platform, basically.
You do a lot of work for in the area of user experience and user interfaces. How has that particular area evolved over the last couple of years?
Well, I think everyone takes user-centered design more seriously these days. It used to be a bit of a niche thing. For us, it's all about kind of understanding what our client's trying to achieve and then making sure we do everything, from the perspective of a user, making sure we ideally talk to users, kind of, working out what will actually work properly for people.
How do you see that evolving in the next couple of years?
People are doing more and more user testing. There's like user experience conferences these days that are becoming lots more popular. Things like testing tools like InVision and other things like this kind of encourage people to prototype more, which is a really good way to kind of get ideas out quickly and just test them with real people.
Do you see the user experience area changing with newer interfaces like voice and that type of thing as more people access the web through voice and various other I would say newer interfaces?
Yeah, I'm sure it will do. I think there's quite specialist areas. People are kind of looking into like how people interact with voice, and obviously there's like data and privacy things about how if voice is always on and things like this, so people are kind of becoming more comfortable with it. We've not done a lot of work with voice ourselves, but I read up on blogs where people kind of look into this stuff. It'd be quite interesting.
Where do you see the growth in your digital practice coming from in the next year or so?
Well, we're kind of developing more progressive web apps recently. It's kind of an interesting kind of technology area we're starting to work on. A few years back, we developed a kind of mobile app for a charity, international charity, CBM. And then a few years later, we needed to kind of expand that, add languages. And it's essentially an app to allow people to read humanitarian advice for disaster areas. If you're Red Cross, say, and you're kind of in a disaster area and you want to know how to do certain humanitarian work, making sure disabilities are kind of considered, basically, which their CBM are trying to come up with international standards for. We hit some problems after a few years of building that as a native app because all the technology's changed, unfortunately. So it was using hybrid JavaScript libraries that are now legacy, unfortunately. So progressive web apps is more of a kind of open web standard. So that's something that's just built into browsers, and we're hoping, can make websites more app-like, support things like offline and notifications, things like geolocations. Probably people have seen a lot, obviously, on things like Google Maps. So that kind of technology is quite an interesting area, one we're starting to use more and more.
Right, and clearly that's very, very important for a lot of your clients who are in the transportation industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about headless or Gutenberg and how you think that's had an impact on user interfaces or even user design.
Sure. We've started to develop more kind of headless CMS approaches with websites where WordPress CMS is, say, decoupled from the front end. It doesn't, that is just a technology thing, so that itself doesn't really affect the user. What helps us, though, is that we have more freedom on the front end. So we're able to kind of build a more interesting kind of user experience for the end user, faster as well often, which kind of helps with things like deadlines, of course. It just helps us kind of be a bit more free, let front-end developers kind of excel at the work they do, rather than, say, getting bogged down by how a particular CMS might work. So that's really kind of helped us over the last year or so.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the biggest challenges that you often encounter when you're thinking about building a really, really compelling user experience?
Yeah, well, it's making sure you're building the right stuff for users. It's really easy to make a bunch of assumptions, as like the client will do, obviously, and we obviously have lots of experience, but knowing as technology gets more complicated, which direction to actually take is sometimes quite difficult. So it kind of goes back to ideally testing with users if you can, which isn't always possible, but when it is, it's a really, really helpful thing to do.
How are you handling things like, data privacy, which is obviously all important these days?
Of course, yeah. So things like data privacy have become a lot, as you say, a lot more important to us over the last few years. That kind of has to be baked into how you approach projects. The idea of trying to minimize the data you collect, trying to be responsible, actually having discussions with clients about what they're doing with data, things like cookies, which is becoming more and more difficult just to say, I'm going to just track everything with all these advertising cookies. We had a project recently with a client where they had a data protection officer, so they were a bit more savvy to this kind of stuff as well. And we ended up taking the approach of kind of, an active user opt-in as such. So not even advertising cookies or Facebook type stuff was tracked unless someone actually opted in, which is, from our stats we looked at, we lost about 80% of the traffic, which was measured via things like, advertising or Facebook kind of pixel tracking. Which is good from a user perspective, but obviously then it makes analyzing data for marketing a lot harder.
Right.
But you have to have that kind of, you have to be honest to people. It has to work. I think there's a law announcement from the European Court only today talked about you have to have active consent for users before you set things like these advertising cookies.
Do you see clients getting more sophisticated around this whole data minimization principles and things like that?
Hopefully. I mean, we did a bunch of work when GDPR came out last year, which took way longer than I was expecting it to, just to try and advise clients. We wrote a few blog posts just about that. So people are asking us a lot, which is good. Someone did only this week, actually. It's difficult sometimes for us to advise exactly the right way to do stuff because there's not a huge amount of practical guidance sometimes on exactly what you have to do. Like, is it okay to track Google Analytics, for example, for everyone without permission? Which is probably not. It seems to be the answer at the moment, so you have to be a bit cautious of that. I've heard of some companies developing their own analytics or using alternative analytics platforms to kind of get around that kind of problem. But yeah, customers are definitely asking more and more, which is good to see.
Yeah. I mean, I think from the user perspective, some of these principles are actually good for the overall user experience, right? Because instead of filling out all this information, you're actually not filling out as much, which is always helpful.
And you get a bit more confidence for you not being tracked about you knowing about it. People always kind of think, I'm being tracked around the web and I bought something over on Amazon and then I go to another site and it has an advert for the same thing. That's kind of a bit unsettling. And the more news stories you get about the massive players like Facebook, kind of the things that don't go so well, people they expect everyone else to be able to have the same kind of standard. So like even small, medium businesses need to be able to take privacy seriously as well. And it's the law. So, we are basically, a data processor effectively in GDPR. So if there's a complaint, we have to assist our client to actually sort it out, which we would do obviously.
I wonder if you could share some of the the case studies of great UX experiences that you've built on behalf of clients.
We've done quite a lot of really nice map systems over the last few years. That kind of started with when we worked on Crossrail with their kind of route map, which showed things like where the current works are happening, and at one point showed you where the tunnel boring machine was, which is kind of fun, and things like archaeological digs and kind of useful information. So it's quite, we've found it quite nice to kind of layer on information on top of kind of mapping systems, such as Google. We use Leaflet as well, which is an open source system. We did a similar thing a few years ago for a local archaeology organisation for Cambourne, which is kind of like a new build just north, kind of west of Cambridge, I believe. And again, you can just see when the archaeological team went in before they built the entire town, you could see all the kind of old artefacts and Saxon buildings and things like this, which is just nice for the community. So that kind of stuff's quite fun mapping tools.
One of the questions we love asking guests is a book that you'd like to recommend for our viewers.
Yeah, I've been reading Jason Fried from Basecamp, his book called It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work, which is quite nice. It's really kind of short snippets of tips, but their kind of philosophy is you don't have to just work stupid hours all the time, and you can actually build an ethical business and run it properly, which is really nice. There's some nice tips in there.
That was Simon Jones, founder and managing partner of Studio 24.